In the blistering dust of an Arizona town square, where the August sun beat down like divine judgment upon the assembled crowd, a widow's voice cut through the jeering mob with words that would haunt Blackwood Creek for generations. Sarah Sterling stood before the gallows, her weathered hands clutching a leather pouch heavy with every coin she possessed, and made an offer that silenced even the vultures circling overhead. She would trade her entire fortune, her land, her future, for the life of the Apache warrior bound in irons before her, a man the town had already condemned to death. But to understand how a woman came to bargain with demons for the life of her enemy, one must first know what Blackwood Creek had made of Sarah Sterling in the months before that fateful morning. She had been widowed barely a year when the whispers began, cruel insinuations that followed her 6 children through the mercantile and the church steps like smoke from a forbidden fire. Her eldest, Caleb, bore the weight of 15 years, and his father's name like twin crosses, his jaw set in that stubborn Sterling way that made the townspeople nervous. The younger ones, ranging down to little Emma who had just turned 4, moved through their days like ghosts haunting a ranch that seemed to wither no matter how hard they worked the unforgiving soil. The house itself stood at the edge of town, close enough to see the church steeple, but far enough that respectable folks needn't acknowledge its existence. Its walls held secrets that Sarah had only begun to uncover after burying her husband, Thomas Sterling, a man whose smile had once charmed her, and whose ledgers now revealed transactions stained with blood money and broken treaties. She had found the first bundle of documents hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his study, correspondence with government officials that detailed payments for information about Apache movements, for lies that led warriors into ambushes, for silence purchased with gold while families burned in their lodges. Each page she read carved deeper into her understanding that she had shared her bed with a man who dealt in death, and now his debts, both moral and monetary, had fallen upon her shoulders like stones. Colonel Jedediah Vance controlled Blackwood Creek the way a man might control a well-trained dog, with a firm hand and the occasional strategic blow to maintain order. His compound sat on the hill overlooking town, a reminder that true power in the territory came not from the ballot box, but from the barrel of a gun and the weight of gold in the territorial bank. He watched the Sterling ranch with the patience of a circling hawk, waiting for the moment when the widow's resolve would crack and he could claim her land for his expanding empire. Beside him in this vigil stood Reverend Ezekiel Thorne, whose sermons painted the Sterling children as carriers of their father's sin, innocents who would be better served in the bosom of the church orphanage than in the corrupting influence of a mother who clearly could not manage her husband's legacy. The day Taza was brought to Blackwood Creek in chains, the temperature had climbed past 100 degrees before noon, and the air shimmered with heat that made everything seem unreal, like a fever dream painted in ochre and blood. The Apache warrior had been captured 3 days prior, lured into a false parley by promises of safe conduct to discuss peace terms, only to find himself surrounded by Vance's hired guns the moment he laid down his weapons in good faith. Now he stood in the town square, his face betraying nothing, while the colonel announced that his execution would serve as an example to any savage who dared to resist the march of civilization. The crowd that gathered was not there for justice, but for entertainment, their eyes bright with the prospect of violence sanctioned by authority. Sarah had not planned to attend the spectacle. She had been in the mercantile, trading her last dozen eggs for flour, and trying to ignore the pity in the shopkeeper's eyes. When she heard the commotion outside, something drew her to the square, perhaps the same instinct that makes a moth fly toward flame. Knowing destruction awaits but unable to resist the pull, she pushed through the crowd until she could see the warrior clearly, see the way he held himself with dignity despite the iron shackles, see the scars that mapped a lifetime of survival across his arms and shoulders, see in his eyes not hatred, but a terrible, ancient understanding that this is how the world ends for men like him. And in that moment, standing in the dust while the noose swayed in the hot wind, Sarah Sterling made a decision that would unravel every carefully laid plan of the powerful men who thought they controlled her destiny. She stepped forward, opened her pouch of gold coins so they caught the sunlight, and spoke her offer loud enough for every witness to hear. her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. She would buy this man's life, claim him as property if that was what the law required, take responsibility for his actions, and bind him to her service until his debt was paid. The crowd fell silent, shocked not just by the offer, but by the audacity of a woman challenging the colonel's authority in front of the entire town. Colonel Vance's face darkened like a thundercloud, but he was trapped by his own greed and the presence of the territorial marshal who happened to be visiting that week. To refuse the offer would be to admit the execution was not about justice, but about spectacle, about maintaining fear through public murder. His fingers drummed against his belt as he calculated angles and outcomes, weighing the satisfaction of the hanging against the substantial gold now glinting in Sarah's hands, and the potential complications of denying a lawful transaction before a federal witness. The marshal, sensing the tension, declared that such a purchase was indeed legal under territorial statute, provided proper documentation was filed, and the prisoner's behavior was guaranteed by the buyer. The warrior's eyes met Sarah's for the first time, and in that brief exchange passed a communication that needed no language. He saw a woman as trapped as he was, desperate enough to gamble everything on a gesture that made no practical sense, driven by something deeper than reason. She saw a man who expected death and was receiving instead a strange kind of bondage, his life purchased but his freedom still denied, though by different chains than those he currently wore. Neither trusted the other, but both recognized in that moment a shared enemy in the men who controlled their fates, and sometimes common enemies make for necessary allies even when hope seems foolish. The sun was already high when Taza first set foot on Sterling land, his wrists still marked with iron burns where the shackles had been removed. Sarah led him toward the ranch in silence, aware of how the scene must appear to anyone watching from town, a widow bringing home a savage under the pretense of labor, inviting scandal and danger through her own gate. Behind her, she could feel Caleb's suspicious gaze boring into her back, as her eldest son followed at a distance with the younger children clustered around him like nervous quail. The house rose before them, its paint peeling, its porch sagging, a structure held together more by stubbornness than sound carpentry. The warrior moved across the threshold, as one might enter a cave that could contain either shelter or ambush, his eyes cataloging every shadow, every potential weapon, every route of escape. He had been prepared for death, had sung his death song in the cell the night before, had made peace with joining his ancestors in the spirit world. This strange reprieve confused him more than gratitude could encompass. White settlers did not spare Apache warriors out of mercy. There was always a calculation, always an angle. He studied this widow with her calloused hands and haunted eyes, searching for the trap he knew must be hidden somewhere in this transaction. Sarah had prepared a space in the barn, not out of cruelty but because she understood that forcing him into the house would be too much too soon, both for her children's fears and for his dignity. She showed him the bedroll she had laid out, the water barrel, the simple tools he would use for the work ahead. Through gestures and the few words of Spanish they shared, she communicated expectations: repair the fences, tend the animals, help with the heavy labor her sons were still too young to manage alone. In exchange, food, shelter, and life. The terms were simple, though the reality beneath them was anything but. The first test came within hours, when Caleb confronted his mother in the kitchen while Taza worked in the corral, his movements efficient despite the lingering weakness from days in the cell. The boy's voice cracked with confusion and anger as he demanded to know what she was thinking, bringing an Apache warrior to sleep in their barn, trusting him near his siblings, gambling their safety on a mad impulse that everyone in town would see as proof the Sterling family had finally lost all sense. His words carried the weight of responsibility beyond his years, the burden of being the man of the house when he was still just a frightened child himself. Sarah could not explain to her son that she had seen something in that town square that transcended logic, a moment of recognition that felt like destiny reaching out its hand. She spoke instead of practical matters, how the ranch was failing without proper help, how the work was too much for children, how this arrangement might buy them time before Vance found another excuse to take their land. But, Underneath her practical words ran a deeper current she could not name, a sense that saving this warrior's life had been the first choice truly her own since Thomas died. The first act that defied the crushing weight of other people's expectations. Her hands moved through the familiar motions of preparing dinner, while she explained that trust was not required, only vigilance, and time to prove whether her gamble would destroy them or save them. The younger children watched Taza through the windows, with the wide-eyed fascination usually reserved for wild animals in cages. 10-year-old Rebecca whispered that she had heard Apache warriors could see in the dark and talk to spirits, while 8-year-old Michael insisted that their mother had brought home a demon disguised as a man. Only Emma, too young to carry the full weight of prejudice, approached the corral fence where Taza worked. Her small fingers curled around the weathered wood as she watched him gentle a nervous horse with patience that seemed almost supernatural. The warrior noticed the child but did not acknowledge her directly, knowing that any attention from him might send her running in terror, or bring the boy Caleb charging to her rescue. As evening fell and the first meal was shared, an awkward affair with Sarah bringing food to the barn, she noticed details that troubled and intrigued her in equal measure. The way Taza examined every item she handed him, checking for poison or hidden threats. The scars on his back that told stories of survival against odds no man should face. The medicine bundle he had somehow kept hidden through his capture and imprisonment, now placed carefully on a small shelf he had constructed from scrap wood, a gesture of claiming space that was both defiant and hopeful. He ate slowly, as if expecting each bite to be his last, and when he looked at her with gratitude mixed with wariness, she saw reflected in his eyes the same exhaustion she felt every night when she finally allowed herself to stop moving and acknowledge how close to the edge they all were. The plot twist revealed itself near midnight when Sarah, unable to sleep, walked the property as she often did when worries crowded her mind. She found Taza awake as well, standing in the darkness near the eastern fence line, his posture alert in a way that made her pulse quicken with alarm. She approached quietly, following his gaze until she too could see what had drawn his attention. Fresh tracks in the dust, boot prints too large and numerous to belong to any of her children, circling the property as if taking measurements. Someone had been on her land while they all slept, and the pattern of the tracks suggested not casual trespassing, but deliberate surveillance, a threat assessing its target before striking. The warrior turned to face her, and without words they shared the understanding that the colonel had not simply accepted defeat in the town square. Vance was watching, waiting, documenting, building a case or planning something that would circumvent the law's inconvenient protection. Taza gestured toward the tracks, then toward the house where her children slept, and the message was clear. The danger to this family had not ended with his reprieve, but had merely changed shape. Sarah felt ice settle in her stomach despite the warm night air, recognizing that her act of defiance had painted an even larger target on her family's back. The men who ruled Blackwood Creek did not forgive challenges to their authority, and a widow who dared to undermine the colonel's spectacle would pay for that audacity one way or another. 3 days after Taza arrived at the Sterling Ranch, the first real test of Sarah's gamble arrived with the same inevitability as summer storms building over the distant mountains. Young Michael had been playing near the creek that marked the southern boundary of their property when he disturbed a nest of rattlesnakes hidden in the rocks, and his screams brought everyone running. By the time Sarah reached the water's edge, her son lay pale and shaking, twin puncture wounds already swelling on his calf, his breath coming in short gasps that spoke of venom moving through his small body like liquid fire. Caleb had frozen, his hunting knife drawn but useless against an enemy that had already struck, while Rebecca held Emma back from rushing to her brother's side. The warrior arrived from the upper fields where he had been mending irrigation channels, and in that moment, Sarah faced a choice that crystallized everything into brutal clarity. The town doctor lived 40 minutes away on a fast horse, and even then might not arrive in time with the anti-venom that could save Michael's life. But Taza was already moving with purpose toward the boy, his hands reaching for the medicine bundle he kept tied at his waist. And Sarah understood that she had seconds to decide whether to trust an Apache warrior with her son's life, or gamble on conventional help that might arrive too late. She saw Caleb's hand tighten on his knife, saw the naked fear in her eldest son's eyes as he weighed which death would be worse, poison or placing his brother in the hands of the enemy. Sarah stepped aside and told Caleb to lower his weapon, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even herself. Taza knelt beside Michael with the gentleness of long practice, his scarred hands moving swiftly as he examined the bite, assessed the boy's symptoms, calculated how much time remained before the venom reached the heart. He pulled items from his medicine bundle with the precision of a surgeon selecting instruments. Dried herbs that Sarah had never seen, small vials containing substances she could not identify, a bone knife that gleamed white against his copper skin. He began to work, cutting near the wound to help drain the venom, applying poultices that smelled of sage and something sharper, creating a mixture that he indicated Michael must drink despite the boy's groans of protest. The healing was not gentle, and Michael's screams as the medicine burned against the poison in his blood cut through Sarah's heart like broken glass. She held her son's hand while Taza worked with focused intensity, chanting in a language that sounded like wind through canyon walls, like water over ancient stones, like prayers older than any church. The other children watched from a distance, drawn by fear and fascination as the Apache warrior fought death itself for their brother's life. An hour passed, then two, the sun climbing higher as Taza applied cool cloths to Michael's forehead, made him drink more of the bitter medicine, monitored his pulse with fingers pressed against the boy's wrist in a gesture that transcended cultural divides. When Michael's breathing finally steadied and color began returning to his cheeks, when the swelling started to recede and consciousness returned to his eyes, Sarah felt something shift in the air around them. Caleb lowered his knife completely, his face showing confusion mixed with grudging recognition of a debt owed. Rebecca whispered that maybe the Apache warrior was not a demon after all, but something else, something she had no words for. Even Emma toddled forward and placed her small hand on Taza's arm, in a gesture of trust that made the warrior's stoic expression crack for just a moment, revealing something achingly human beneath his careful mask. The plot twist arrived that evening, when the moral inspector Reverend Thorne had appointed finally made his appearance at the ranch. Brother Josiah Pike was a thin man with ferret eyes and a Bible worn smooth from constant handling, sent to document any evidence that Sarah Sterling was unfit to care for her children, or that the Apache savage she had foolishly brought into her home posed a danger warranting immediate removal. He had been watching from the ridgeline all afternoon through a spyglass, had seen everything that transpired at the creek, and now he stood in Sarah's kitchen with accusations already forming on his lips. He had witnessed the warrior cutting the child with a knife, forcing the boy to drink unknown substances, performing savage rituals over him instead of seeking proper Christian medical care. He was prepared to testify that Sarah had endangered her son's life through negligence and pagan influence. But Sarah saw the trap for what it was, the way Pike's eyes gleamed with satisfaction as he prepared to report back to Thorne and Vance. She led him to Michael's room where the boy now slept peacefully, the wound already showing signs of healing that would have taken weeks under conventional treatment. She explained in careful, measured tones exactly what had happened, how quickly the warrior had acted, how her son would have died without that intervention. She offered to take Michael to the town doctor now, to have his recovery verified by medical authority, knowing that the evidence of successful treatment would undermine Pike's narrative, even as she understood it would not stop the inspector from twisting facts to suit his purposes. The inspector left with promises that his report would be thorough and honest, words that rang hollow in the evening air. After he departed, Sarah found Taza standing alone in the barn, his medicine bundle open before him as he carefully replaced each item in its proper position. She approached with gratitude heavy on her tongue, but when their eyes met, she saw he was waiting not for thanks, but for her to finally ask the question that had been building since he saved Michael. She wanted to know why an Apache warrior kept healing knowledge that could save the children of his enemies, why he had fought so hard for a boy who carried the blood of those who had destroyed his people. The answer came not in words but in a gesture, as Taza pulled aside his shirt to reveal a scar over his heart, old and deep, marking where he too had once been saved by an unexpected mercy that defied all logic and tribal loyalty, a debt he had carried for 20 years and never been able to repay until this afternoon, when another child's life hung in the balance. The weeks following Michael's recovery brought a transformation to the Sterling Ranch that was both subtle and profound, like water slowly reshaping stone through persistent patience. The younger children began to shadow Taza as he worked, their initial fear metamorphosing into curiosity and eventually something approaching reverence. They watched him track rabbits through brush by reading signs invisible to untrained eyes, observed how he could predict rain by studying ant behavior and wind patterns, learned that strength was not just about muscle but about understanding the land as a living thing that spoke to those who knew how to listen. Rebecca found herself drawing pictures of the plants he identified, creating a catalog of which leaves could heal and which could kill, knowledge passed down through generations that had never been written in any book the Reverend would approve. Caleb resisted longest, his loyalty to his father's memory warring with what his eyes showed him daily. The Apache warrior worked harder than any hired hand they could have afforded, repairing years of neglect with skill that spoke of deep craftsmanship. He rebuilt the chicken coop so cleverly that foxes could no longer breach it, diverted water to fields that had been dry for seasons, taught the boys to set snares that caught game without causing suffering. More troubling to Caleb's rigid worldview was the way Taza treated Sarah with a respect his own father had rarely shown, stepping aside when she passed, listening when she spoke, never presuming authority over household decisions despite his obvious competence. It challenged everything the 15-year-old thought he understood about savages and civilization, forcing him to confront the possibility that truth was more complicated than the Sunday sermons allowed. Sarah found herself sharing evening meals with the warrior more frequently, no longer relegating him to the barn, but inviting him to the kitchen table where conversation happened in fragments of Spanish and Apache and English, 3 languages trying to build a bridge. He told her stories of his people's relationship with the land, how every rock and canyon held memory, how the mountains themselves were sacred teachers if one learned their lessons. She shared her own history, carefully editing around her husband's sins, but revealing enough about her isolation and fear to make clear she understood what it meant to be cast out by your own people. They discovered they both knew loss on a scale that made ordinary grief seem inadequate. Both carried ghosts that haunted their sleep. Both had made choices they could never undo. The plot twist emerged during one of these conversations when Taza mentioned recognizing a name in the documents Sarah kept hidden in her husband's study, papers she had not yet shown anyone but had continued searching through late at night when the children slept. At her startled expression, he explained that Thomas Sterling's name had been spoken around Apache fires, not with hatred as she expected, but with profound sadness, as the man who had been present at Sand Creek years before coming to Arizona, who had tried to warn the village but arrived too late, who had afterward become someone else entirely, his soul broken by what he witnessed. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow, reframing her understanding of the man she had married and lost. Thomas had not been born a dealer in blood, but had been made into one by trauma that destroyed his ability to distinguish friend from enemy, guilt that twisted into greed and finally into the corruption that killed him. This new understanding of her husband's descent into moral bankruptcy brought Sarah no comfort, only a deeper recognition that violence and trauma created chains that bound generations. She had been so focused on protecting her children from their father's literal debts that she had not fully grasped they were also inheriting his spiritual ones, the karma of actions taken in rage and pain that echoed forward through time. Taza seemed to understand her realization without further explanation, nodding slowly as if he too had wrestled with questions of inherited guilt and how to break cycles that seemed eternal. He told her that his own father had died at Sand Creek, which meant that by blood logic he should hate her children for what their father had done. Yet here he sat, teaching them to survive in a world that wanted them broken or dead, repaying the debt of one attempted mercy with another. The peaceful rhythm of these weeks was shattered on a Tuesday morning when Colonel Vance himself rode onto the property with Reverend Thorne and Brother Pike, accompanied by 3 territorial marshals in official capacity. They came with documents and accusations, claiming that witnesses had seen the Apache warrior leaving the Sterling property at night to meet with members of his tribe, potentially planning raids or insurrection. The evidence was fabricated. Sarah knew it instantly from the way Pike would not meet her eyes, but the marshals were required to investigate any claims of ongoing hostility. They demanded to search the barn and question Taza, and Sarah had no legal standing to refuse them access to her property or her purchased laborer. What the colonel's men found in the barn was not evidence of war planning, but something far more damaging to their narrative. Taza had been constructing, piece by careful piece, a series of wooden toys for the Sterling children. A horse for Emma, intricate figures for Rebecca's stories, a small bow for Michael with arrows blunted for safe practice, and most remarkable, a carving for Caleb that depicted a warrior and a young man standing together, looking toward a horizon unmarked by violence. The marshals stood awkwardly amid this evidence of craft and care, their accusations withering in the face of reality that refused to fit the colonel's story. One of the marshals, an older man with kind eyes, picked up the carving meant for Caleb and studied it with an expression suggesting he too had children, too understood what these objects represented. Vance's face darkened with rage at having his scheme so thoroughly undermined, but he was not finished. He produced another document, this one claiming that several local ranchers had reported livestock missing and tracks suggesting Apache raiders working in the area. As the owner of record for Taza's labor, Sarah would be held financially and legally responsible for any crimes he committed or aided, and given the recent reports, the colonel was within his authority to recommend that the territorial government revoke her ownership and return the warrior to custody pending investigation. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. Either the missing livestock was real and Taza was guilty, or it was fabricated, and proving innocence would require resources Sarah did not have. Either path led to the warrior's removal and Sarah's increased vulnerability to whatever final move Vance was planning. The chapter ended with the marshals agreeing to return in 3 days for Taza's removal, giving Sarah that narrow window to either prove his innocence or prepare for his loss. As the colonel rode away, his satisfied smile visible even from a distance, Sarah stood with Taza and her children around her, all of them understanding that the peace they had built was as fragile as morning frost, beautiful and temporary, melting under the first touch of malicious heat. The warrior's expression was unreadable as he watched the riders disappear in a cloud of dust, but his hand moved to touch the medicine bundle at his waist, in what Sarah had learned was a gesture of preparation, a warrior readying himself for whatever battle came next, whether he faced it alone or surrounded by this strange family that had somehow become worth defending. The 3 days before the marshal's return passed with the quality of a fever dream, time stretching and compressing unpredictably, while Sarah fought panic with planning. She sent Caleb to town with instructions to gather any information about the supposedly missing livestock, to listen to gossip and mark who was spreading stories and who remained silent. The boy returned with troubling news. 6 ranchers had indeed reported losses, but the curious thing was that all the affected ranches belonged to men who owed money to Colonel Vance, or whose land bordered his expanding holdings. The coincidence was too perfect, the pattern too clear, and it pointed toward a systematic effort to create evidence where none existed, or perhaps to create actual losses that would be blamed on the convenient scapegoat currently living in the Sterling barn. Taza spent those days teaching the older children survival skills with new urgency, as if he knew his time with them was measured in hours. He showed Caleb how to read the land for water sources, how to move through brush without sound, how to set a snare that would feed a family in desperate times. To Rebecca, he taught the sacred significance of certain plants, not just their medicinal properties, but the stories that gave them meaning, the Apache understanding that everything growing had a purpose in the great web of connection. Even little Emma received lessons, though hers came in the form of games that taught her to be still and observant, skills that might save her life if the family ever needed to disappear into the wilderness. The plot twist came on the second night when Taza woke Sarah well after midnight, his hand over her mouth to prevent her from crying out in surprise. He led her to the barn where he had set up a careful watch, and together they observed shadows moving through the southern pasture, where their few remaining cattle grazed. Sarah's breath caught as she recognized the careful, deliberate movements of men cutting out livestock, driving them silently toward the creek and away from the property. These were not Apache raiders, but white men, professionals from their coordination, working with the precision of those who had done this before and expected no interruption. They were creating evidence in real time, manufacturing the crimes they would then attribute to the warrior who slept in the Sterling barn. Sarah wanted to raise an alarm, to ride for the nearest marshal, to somehow prevent the theft that would be used to condemn Taza, but the warrior placed a restraining hand on her arm, his eyes sharp in the moonlight, as he made clear through gesture that this was precisely what Vance wanted. For them to act rashly, to give the colonel's men any excuse to claim self-defense or lawful execution when they cut them down. Instead, Taza did something Sarah never expected. He left the barn silently and followed the rustlers at a distance, moving through the darkness with the ghostly skill that made Apache warriors legendary and terrifying to their enemies. He was gone for hours, leaving Sarah to pace the barn in an agony of worry, imagining him captured or killed or worse, confirming every prejudice by actually joining forces with raiders who might indeed be his people. He returned just before dawn, and with him came understanding that changed everything. The rustlers had driven the Sterling cattle to a ravine 5 miles south, where they joined other stolen livestock, all of it being held in a natural corral until Vance was ready to move the evidence. More importantly, Taza had recognized one of the rustlers as a man who frequented the colonel's compound, had seen him coming and going with messages and supplies, had marked him as someone in Vance's direct employ. The theft was not the work of Apache raiders, but of the colonel's own men, creating justification for whatever final move he planned against the Sterling family. It was theft serving a larger purpose, and that purpose was becoming horrifyingly clear. Vance wanted Sarah's land badly enough to manufacture a crisis that would let him seize it under color of law. When morning came, Sarah made a decision that terrified her even as she recognized its necessity. She would not wait for the marshals to return and take Taza based on fabricated evidence. Instead, she would seek out the documents Thomas had hidden more carefully, the papers he had kept separate from the others, the evidence he must have gathered before his death that implicated Vance in crimes far worse than cattle theft. Her husband had died in what everyone assumed was a riding accident, his body found at the base of a cliff with his neck broken and his horse standing nearby. But Sarah had always wondered about the timing, about how conveniently Thomas died just after he began asking uncomfortable questions about land deals and missing federal funds, about massacres that seemed orchestrated rather than organic conflicts. The hiding place revealed itself through logic and memory. Thomas had been a careful man before he became a broken one, and his study contained a false panel that Sarah discovered only by remembering a night years ago when she had seen him emerge from his office with dust on his knees, the kind that came from crawling on floors rather than sitting at desks. She pulled up the boards with a crowbar while Taza kept watch, and there in the space beneath she found what Thomas had died protecting: correspondence between Colonel Vance and territorial officials, detailing a systematic campaign to provoke conflicts with Apache bands, to blame them for crimes committed by Vance's own men, to seize their traditional lands and the lands of any settlers who stood in the way. The documents outlined payments to witnesses who would testify to Indian atrocities that never happened, to marshals who would look the other way during suspicious deaths, to politicians who would authorize military actions based on manufactured intelligence. Most damning of all were the financial records showing how Vance had been siphoning federal funds meant for Indian relief, using the money to purchase land cheaply during forced sales, building his empire on the backs of starving families, both Apache and white. Thomas had been meticulous in his documentation, perhaps hoping to redeem himself by exposing the corruption he had once aided, and his reward had been a shattered neck at the bottom of a cliff. Sarah held the papers with shaking hands, understanding that these documents represented either salvation or death warrant, depending on whether she could get them to someone with the authority and courage to act on them. Taza studied the papers with eyes that could not read English, but could recognize the weight of evidence when he saw it. He made a series of gestures that Sarah had learned to interpret over weeks of growing understanding. They needed to leave, to run, to get these documents to the territorial capital, where a federal circuit judge was reportedly due to arrive within days. The judge would have jurisdiction over territorial officials, could order investigations that local authorities would have to respect, could potentially bring down the colonel's entire network of corruption. But the journey to the capital would take 3 days through dangerous country, and Vance had eyes everywhere. They would be hunted from the moment they left, if the colonel learned of their departure in time to organize pursuit. The chapter ended with Sarah gathering her children in the kitchen before dawn, explaining in terms both honest and terrifying that they were leaving their home, perhaps forever. They would ride for the territorial capital with nothing but what they could carry, trusting their lives to their mother's desperate gamble, and to the warrior who had somehow become their protector, despite every reason for him to abandon them to their fate. Caleb argued for staying and fighting, his 15-year-old pride unwilling to admit they could not defend their own home. But Sarah showed him the papers, let him read enough to understand what his father had discovered and died for, and watched her eldest son's face age years in minutes as he grasped the true scope of the danger they faced. They would leave at first light, riding hard for the mountains that marked the edge of Vance's immediate control, hoping to disappear into the wilderness that Taza knew, and the colonel's men did not. The dawn that found the Sterling family fleeing their ranch broke bloody red across the Arizona sky, as if the land itself mourned their departure or warned of violence to come. Sarah had packed only essentials: food, water, blankets, the documents sewn into a leather case she wore strapped to her body beneath her shirt, and weapons enough to make any pursuit think twice. Taza led them not toward the main road, but into the broken country of the Dragoon foothills, following trails that existed more in memory than reality. Paths his people had used for generations to move unseen through territory claimed by others. The children rode double on their 3 horses, with Sarah and Taza taking turns on foot to spare the animals in the brutal heat already building despite the early hour. By mid-morning, they found evidence that Vance had indeed learned of their flight and was organizing pursuit. Dust rose in columns to the west where riders spread out in a search pattern, trying to anticipate which direction a widow and 6 children might flee. But Taza guided them east and north, into terrain that grew progressively more hostile, where water was scarce and the sun beat down with physical force. The children bore the hardship with remarkable courage, even Emma staying quiet when the warrior signaled danger, understanding with the instinct of small creatures that silence meant survival. Rebecca kept count of their water consumption, rationing it with mathematical precision, while Caleb rode rear guard with his father's rifle across his lap, no longer a boy playing at manhood, but a young man being forged by necessity into something harder. The plot twist revealed itself that first night when they made camp in a canyon that Taza chose with specific purpose. Sarah noticed him studying the rock walls with intensity that suggested more than casual interest, and when she questioned him through gestures and broken Spanish, he explained through story rather than direction. This place had been a stronghold once, in his grandfather's time, a refuge where families gathered when enemies came too close. The canyon had a hidden spring that ran underground, accessible only through a crack in the stone that looked like natural shadow, and the walls provided defensive positions that made direct assault nearly suicidal. More importantly, the canyon was considered sacred ground, a place where even in war certain protocols had to be observed, where violence was forbidden by custom older than any living Apache. As Taza led them to the spring, and they filled their canteens with cold water that tasted of stone and secrets, Sarah understood they were not just fleeing through wilderness, but being guided through a landscape that held meaning and history she was only beginning to glimpse. The warrior was not simply leading them away from danger, but toward something specific, a destination he had chosen from the moment they decided to run. She wanted to ask what that destination was, to understand the full shape of his plan, but exhaustion and the need to stay silent in case pursuit was closer than they knew made questions impossible. They would have to trust him completely, which perhaps had been the point of everything that came before. Learning whether trust could exist between people taught from birth to see each other as enemies. The second day brought physical suffering that tested them all. The children's lips cracked and bled despite careful water rationing. Their skin burned despite the protection of blankets used as makeshift shade during the worst heat of midday. Sarah's feet blistered inside her boots, each step becoming a small agony she endured in silence, lest her pain frighten the younger ones. Only Taza seemed unaffected by the conditions, moving through the landscape with the efficiency of someone for whom this terrain was home, rather than obstacle. He found food where Sarah saw only barren rock, insects that provided protein despite their appearance, cactus fruits that satisfied hunger, roots that could be chewed for moisture. The children learned to eat what he offered without complaint, understanding that survival sometimes meant swallowing pride, along with unpleasant sustenance. It was Caleb who spotted the pursuit first, his young eyes catching the glint of sun on metal where the canyon opened onto a wider valley. He counted at least a dozen riders spread across the landscape like beaters driving game toward hunters, and among them rode Colonel Vance himself, identifiable by his distinctive gray horse and the way the other riders deferred to his positioning. The colonel had not sent hired guns to handle this problem. He was leading the hunt personally, which spoke to either the value he placed on recovering those documents or the depth of his anger at being defied by a widow and a savage. Perhaps both, Sarah thought, watching the distant figures with a dread that settled in her stomach like cold iron. Taza studied the pursuit with professional interest, calculating angles and speed with the mind of someone who had both hunted and been hunted many times before. He made a series of rapid gestures to Sarah, explaining through sign language becoming increasingly fluent between them that their best hope was to reach higher ground before being spotted, to climb into the mountains proper where horses could not easily follow and where the terrain itself became their ally. But the climb would be brutal, especially for the younger children, and they would need to move immediately, abandoning any hope of rest or recovery. The alternative was being trapped in the valley when Vance's net closed, and that was no alternative at all. The ascent into the mountains tested them beyond anything they had yet endured. The trail, such as it was, consisted of loose scree and sharp switchbacks that threatened to send horses and riders tumbling with each misstep. Emma rode clutched against Taza's back, her small arms locked around his neck with the desperation of mortal fear, while he climbed with sure-footed grace that defied the burden. Sarah and Caleb led the horses on foot, coaxing the terrified animals up paths barely wide enough for their hooves. Rebecca and Michael clung to their mount, with white-knuckled determination, no longer thinking about discomfort, but only about not becoming the one whose fall alerted their pursuers to their location. The plot twist came when they crested a ridge and found themselves looking down into a hidden valley that took Sarah's breath away for reasons having nothing to do with exertion. Spread before them was an Apache village, not the scattered remnants she expected, but a functioning community of perhaps 30 families. Their lodges arranged in traditional patterns that spoke of order and continuity. Smoke rose from cooking fires. Children played in a central area. Women worked on hides while men tended weapons and tools. This was not a temporary camp but a permanent settlement, hidden so deep in the mountains that white authorities had no idea it existed. A pocket of resistance that had survived by staying invisible and choosing carefully who knew of its location. Taza's presence brought an immediate reaction from the village. Warriors appeared from lodges in defensive positions with weapons ready, their faces showing recognition mixed with confusion. The warrior called out in Apache, his voice carrying across the valley, and Sarah heard her name spoken amid words she could not understand. A figure emerged from the largest lodge, an older man whose bearing suggested leadership earned through wisdom rather than mere age. He approached slowly, studying the strange group Taza had brought to this secret place, a white woman and her half-dozen children, all of them exhausted and desperate, seeking refuge in a sanctuary they had no right to enter by any logic of the ongoing war between their peoples. Sarah understood without translation that this was the moment where everything would be decided. If this leader rejected them, They had nowhere else to run, no other options remaining. Vance's men would find them eventually, whether hours or days from now, and the documents would be seized or destroyed, the truth buried along with her family. She watched Taza speaking urgently to the elder, saw him gesture toward the children and then toward the valley below, where pursuit would soon arrive. She saw him pull aside his shirt to reveal the old scar he had shown her once before, using it as evidence in an argument Sarah could not hear but felt in her bones. He was calling in debts, invoking obligations, asking his people to extend protection to outsiders in defiance of every reasonable caution that had kept this village safe. The chapter ended with the elder studying Sarah with eyes that had seen more death and loss than any person should carry, eyes that held the weight of decisions made and the ghosts of those who paid their price. He spoke a single word to Taza, and though Sarah did not know Apache, she recognized the sound of conditional acceptance, the granting of temporary sanctuary that came with expectations she could not yet name, but would certainly be called to fulfill. As warriors moved to help them down the final descent into the village, as Vance's riders appeared like distant ants on the ridge they had just abandoned, Sarah clutched her children close and prayed to whatever gods might listen that she had not led them from one danger into another, that this desperate gamble would prove to be salvation rather than a different kind of doom. The Apache village received the Sterling family with careful hospitality that was neither warm nor cold, but watchful, a community assessing whether these outsiders represented opportunity or threat. Taza's word carried them only so far. The rest would depend on their actions and the outcome of deliberations happening in the Elder's Lodge, where Sarah could see men gathering with the gravity of those making decisions that would affect survival. The children huddled together near the lodge where they had been assigned quarters, their exhaustion finally overwhelming fear as they collapsed onto blankets that smelled of sage and smoke. Only Caleb remained alert, his hand never far from his rifle, though Taza had gently suggested the weapon should be set aside while they were guests in this place. Sarah found herself summoned to the Elder's Lodge as the sun reached its zenith, the heat making the air shimmer with distortions that seemed appropriate for a moment where realities were being negotiated. Through Taza's translation, the elder, whose name was Nantan, explained the situation with brutal clarity. The village knew of Colonel Vance, had lost family members to his orchestrated massacres, had watched their traditional lands taken through lies he helped spread. The documents Sarah carried could indeed bring down the colonel if delivered to the federal judge, but doing so would expose the village's location, would invite military investigation of the region, would risk everything this community had built by staying hidden. Why should they endanger themselves for a white woman's revenge, even if it aligned with their own grievances against a common enemy? Sarah had prepared no speech, carried no illusions that she could negotiate from a position of strength. Instead, she showed Nantan the documents, let him see through Taza's translation the extent of Vance's betrayals, the systematic way he had manipulated both Apache and settler against each other to serve his greed. She pointed out entries that detailed payments to men who had fired on both communities during a supposed peace talk, creating the incident that led to the Sand Creek massacre, where Taza's father died and Thomas Sterling's soul broke. She showed him evidence that the coming winter's promised government rations had already been diverted into Vance's accounts, meaning the village would face starvation if they remained hidden and dependent on what had been pledged. The truth was that Vance's corruption threatened them all, and perhaps the only way to survive was to stop hiding and start exposing. The plot twist emerged from one of the other warriors present at the council, a younger man whose scarred face and angry eyes marked him as someone who had lost much and forgiven little. He spoke with passion that needed no translation, his gestures making clear that he advocated for simply killing the Sterling family and taking the documents to the judge themselves, eliminating any white witnesses who could identify the village's location while still achieving the objective of destroying Vance. Several warriors nodded agreement, the logic clean and practical from their perspective. Mercy had never served them well, and survival demanded hard choices. Why should white children be spared when Apache children had died, by the hundreds in massacres documented in Sarah's papers. Taza rose to his feet with a suddenness that drew every eye, his voice cutting through the debate with authority Sarah had not heard from him before. He spoke rapidly in Apache, his hand moving to gesture at Sarah and then at the children visible through the lodge opening, and though Sarah could not understand the words, she heard the passion in his voice, the argument being made with everything he had. Nantan held up a hand for silence and turned to Sarah, explaining through Taza's translation what had been said. The warrior had invoked an old obligation, a life debt that bound him to protect those who showed mercy when they had no requirement to do so. More than that, he had argued that the children were innocent of their father's crimes, that they represented a possibility for different futures, that killing them would make the village no better than Vance and his men. The council debated for hours while Sarah waited outside with her children, watching the sun track across the sky and wondering if she would see it set. She noticed details of village life continuing around them with practiced normalcy. Women preparing food, children being taught to shoot small bows, elders telling stories that made the young ones laugh despite their circumstances. It struck her that this community was not merely surviving, but maintaining culture and connection in the face of systematic attempts to eradicate them. They had every reason to be hard, to trust no one outside their circle, to see her and her children as enemies simply by virtue of birth. That any debate was happening at all, rather than summary execution, spoke to a moral complexity she had not expected. The decision came as the sun touched the western peaks, painting the valley in colors that made everything look both beautiful and temporary. Nantan emerged from the lodge and approached Sarah directly, his aged face showing the weight of leadership and the burden of choices made. Through Taza, he explained that the village would help them reach the territorial capital, would provide guides who knew paths no white man had traveled, would even send warriors to ensure their safety until the documents were delivered. In exchange, Sarah must swear an oath that she would never reveal the location of this village, would never speak of what she had seen here, would take the secret of their survival to her grave. Furthermore, if the documents failed to bring down Vance, if the federal judge proved as corrupt as local authorities, she must return to help them plan a different kind of justice. Sarah swore the oath with her hand on her children's heads, understanding that she was binding them all to a future of shared fate with people she had been taught to fear. But she had learned over these desperate days that fear and prejudice were luxuries of ignorance, that seeing people clearly rather than through the lens of cultural propaganda made simple categories collapse into complicated truth. These Apache people were no more savages than she was a civilized woman. They were simply human beings trying to protect their families in a world that wanted them erased. If allying with them was betrayal of her race, she would gladly bear that mark, for her race had betrayed far more fundamental obligations in service of greed and manifest destiny. The plot twist came as they prepared to depart the next morning, when Nantan pulled Sarah aside one final time, with news that changed her understanding of everything. Taza had never been captured by accident. He had surrendered deliberately, allowing himself to be taken to Blackwood Creek with the express purpose of getting close to someone who might help expose Vance's operations. He had heard through trading networks that Thomas Sterling had gathered evidence before his death, had wagered his life that the widow might be convinced to use it. Sarah's desperate bid to save him in the town square had been the outcome he hoped for, but never expected. An act of irrational mercy that gave him access to the documents and, more importantly, to a white woman who might be convinced to see the truth rather than convenient lies. He had been playing a long game from the moment those irons first touched his wrists. Sarah found Taza preparing horses for the journey, her emotions a whirlwind of betrayal and admiration, anger and understanding. He met her eyes with no apology in his expression, only the stark acknowledgement that survival sometimes required deception, that he had used her even as he came to genuinely care about her children. She wanted to be furious, to feel manipulated, but she could not separate her anger from the recognition that she might have done the same in his position, that his tactical thinking had saved all their lives even as it complicated the connection she thought they had built. In the end, she asked only one question. Had any of his teaching, any of the bond with her children, been real? His answer came not in words, but in the way he lifted Emma onto his shoulders for the journey ahead, the gentle adjustment of Michael's canteen strap, the silent nod of respect toward Caleb that acknowledged the young man he was becoming. Strategy had brought them together, but something beyond strategy had grown in the spaces between plans. The chapter ended with them departing the village under the cover of pre-dawn darkness, a strange procession of white refugees and Apache guides moving through country that belonged to neither, but to the land itself. Behind them, warriors took up positions to delay any pursuit that might have found the valley, willing to fight and die if necessary to give the mission time to succeed. Ahead lay 3 more days of brutal travel, then the territorial capital, and a confrontation with systems of power designed to dismiss and destroy anyone who challenged them. Sarah rode with Thomas's documents pressed against her heart, with Taza scouting ahead like a ghost, with her children arrayed behind her like armor against despair, and she thought that perhaps courage was nothing more than continuing to move forward when every rational calculation suggested surrender. The mountains watched their passage with ancient patience, having seen other desperate journeys across their stones, knowing that this land had always demanded blood payment from those who tried to claim it, regardless of the color of skin or righteousness of cause. The federal circuit judge was a weathered man named Harrison Blackwell, who had seen enough frontier justice to be deeply skeptical of noble savages and reformed settlers alike, but whose allegiance to actual law remained stronger than his prejudices. Sarah presented her evidence in his temporary chambers, a hotel room converted to courthouse by the presence of a portable desk and an American flag, while Taza and the Apache guides waited outside, knowing their presence would only complicate matters. Judge Blackwell read through the documents with increasing intensity, his expression shifting from boredom to interest to barely contained rage, as he absorbed the full scope of Colonel Vance's corruption. These were not ambiguous dealings or questionable judgments, but clear evidence of systematic fraud, of federal crimes that fell squarely within his jurisdiction, and demanded immediate action. But the judge's willingness to act came with complications Sarah had not anticipated. Any investigation would require military involvement given the nature of the charges against a territorial official, would mean soldiers descending on the region to secure evidence and arrest suspects, would inevitably lead to questions about how a widow came to possess these documents and who helped her survive long enough to deliver them. Judge Blackwell was no fool. He could read between the lines of Sarah's carefully edited story and deduce that Apache assistance had been crucial to her journey. He made clear that he would issue warrants and begin proceedings, but he could not guarantee that the village which sheltered her would remain safe from discovery once federal forces started combing the region. The machinery of justice, once set in motion, was neither subtle nor selective about what it ground up in pursuit of truth. Sarah stood at a window watching the street below, where her children waited with Taza in the shadows of an alley, all of them still fugitives until Vance was arrested and the charges documented. She thought about the oath she had sworn to Nantan, about the price the village might pay for helping her, about how justice for some always seemed to require sacrifice from others. The plot twist came when Judge Blackwell offered a solution that was both pragmatic and morally ambiguous. He would delay the investigation for 2 weeks, would give Sarah time to warn her allies to relocate or prepare, would claim the documents came from an anonymous source. In exchange, she must testify in detail about everything her husband had told her, must become the primary witness whose testimony would carry the case if the paper trail proved insufficient. She would have to stand in public court and speak Thomas Sterling's secrets, exposing her own complicity and remaining silent for years, accepting judgment and scorn from both communities. The decision tore at Sarah with physical force, the recognition that seeking justice meant accepting consequences she could not fully control. But as she watched Caleb standing protective guard over his siblings, as she saw Rebecca teaching Emma a hand game while they waited, as she observed Michael's growing confidence in his own survival skills, she understood that her children deserved a world where the truth mattered more than power, where corruption could be challenged without requiring martyrdom. She agreed to Judge Blackwell's terms and watched him begin drafting warrants with the satisfaction of a man who had waited long years to bring actual law to a lawless territory. The warning reached the Apache village through runners moving faster than any cavalry could follow, carrying word that federal forces would soon sweep the region, and the community must relocate to prearranged fallback positions deeper in the mountains. Nantan accepted the news with the fatalism of someone who had moved many times before, who understood that safety was always temporary and survival meant constant adaptation. The village began their exodus within hours, taking only what could be carried, leaving behind structures they could rebuild elsewhere, prioritizing speed over sentiment. Taza had returned to guide them, his obligation to Sarah fulfilled, but his connection to his people calling him home, and she watched him disappear into the wilderness with emotions too complex to name, knowing she owed him her life and her children's futures, but would likely never see him again. The arrest of Colonel Jedediah Vance happened with theatrical force, federal marshals surrounding his compound at dawn with warrants signed by Judge Blackwell himself. Vance resisted, barricading himself with loyal men in a standoff that lasted 6 hours before he surrendered, to avoid bloodshed that would make his crimes undeniable even to political allies. Reverend Thorne was taken into custody alongside him, implicated in the conspiracy through his acceptance of payments to provide moral justification for illegal seizures. Brother Pike vanished the night before the arrests, presumably warned by some remaining loyalist, but his testimony was less crucial than the documents that laid bare years of systematic theft and manufactured conflict. The town of Blackwood Creek woke to discover that the men who had controlled their lives were common criminals, and the reactions ranged from shock to satisfaction, to a disturbing number who simply refused to believe such prominent citizens could be guilty regardless of evidence. Sarah's testimony came in the formal trial 3 months later, held in the territorial capital with spectators filling every available space, and newspapers sending correspondents to document what they billed as the trial of the century. She stood in the witness box and told her story with brutal honesty, concealing only the specific location of the Apache village that had sheltered her, but revealing everything else. Her husband's complicity and eventual attempt at redemption, her own willful ignorance until forced to confront truth, the systematic way Vance had corrupted every institution meant to protect the vulnerable. She spoke for 6 hours across 2 days, and when opposing counsel tried to discredit her by highlighting her alliance with a savage, she looked the attorney in the eyes and said that the Apache warrior had shown more honor and humanity than any civilized Christian she had encountered in Blackwood Creek, and if that made her unreliable, then perhaps the definition of reliability needed examination. The verdict came after 3 weeks of deliberation, the jury returning convictions on 14 of 16 charges against Vance and 8 of 9 against Thorne. The sentences were harsh. 20 years hard labor for the colonel, 15 for the reverend, with additional financial penalties that would strip them of the empires they had built through fraud. More importantly, Judge Blackwell ordered a comprehensive investigation into land titles in the region, promising to restore property to those who had lost it through manufactured crises and forced sales. The Sterling Ranch was secured in Sarah's name with documentation that could not be challenged, and federal relief was authorized to help restore properties damaged by Vance's schemes. It was justice, imperfect and incomplete, but real enough that Sarah could breathe without the weight of constant threat crushing her chest. The plot twist came in the aftermath, when Sarah returned to Blackwood Creek expecting hostility and found instead a complicated mix of respect and distance. Some townspeople thanked her privately for her courage in exposing corruption they had suspected, but feared to challenge. Others avoided her completely, unable to reconcile their worldview with the reality her testimony had forced them to acknowledge. A few remained openly hostile, convinced that she had betrayed her own kind by siding with savages against white authorities. The town would never be comfortable for the Sterling family, but it was theirs by right and law, and Sarah was surprised to find she cared less about acceptance than about the simple ability to work her land and raise her children without fear of being driven out by those who mistook power for righteousness. The final revelation came on a morning 6 months after the trial, when Sarah found a package waiting on her porch, wrapped in oiled leather, and marked only with a symbol she had learned to recognize, the sign used by Taza's people to indicate friendship and respect. Inside was a carved wooden figure, exquisite in its detail, depicting a woman standing between two worlds with children gathered around her feet and mountains rising at her back. No message accompanied it, but none was needed. The warrior who had taught her children to survive, who had guided them through deadly country, who had used her just as she had used him, was acknowledging that something real had existed between their utilitarian alliance and the deep bond neither had names for. The carving joined the others he had made in a place of honor in the Sterling home, and sometimes Sarah would hold it and remember that redemption was possible even in the hardest country, even between people who had every reason to be enemies, even when justice was complicated and victory came at costs no one fully anticipated. The narrative concluded not with false promises of peace or reconciliation between cultures still at war, but with the quieter truth of survival and adaptation. The Sterling children grew up strong and capable, marked by their experiences in ways that would shape the adults they became. Caleb never lost the wariness he had learned, but tempered it with the understanding that human worth could not be measured by skin color or cultural affiliation. Rebecca became a healer, combining the knowledge Taza had taught with formal medical training, serving both white and Apache patients, despite the complications that created. Michael grew into a man who could read the land with two sets of eyes, translating between worlds even when neither fully accepted him. And Emma, too young to remember details but shaped by the story told around family fires, became someone who questioned authority and demanded evidence before accepting convenient lies. Sarah herself lived to see the territory become a state, watched the frontier slowly tame itself through the same violence and compromise that had nearly destroyed her family. She never spoke of the hidden village or Nantan's decision to help her, keeping that oath until her death many years later. But she told her grandchildren about the warrior who taught their parents to survive, about the importance of seeing clearly, rather than through the lens of prejudice, about the cost of justice and the necessity of paying it anyway. On her deathbed, surrounded by a family that had grown from those 6 desperate children, she was asked if she regretted that day in the town square when she offered everything for a stranger's life. Her answer came without hesitation. That single act of irrational mercy had saved her soul more surely than his life, had shown her children that courage meant standing for truth even when the entire world insisted on comfortable lies, had proven that in a land built on violence and greed. The most revolutionary act remained the simple recognition of another human being's right to exist. The mountains endured beyond the lives of those who fought for them, beyond the small dramas of mercy and justice, beyond the rise and fall of empires built on stolen land. The wind still carried stories through the canyons, and sometimes on certain nights when the air was clear and still, you could almost hear the echo of Apache drums mixing with the creaking of wagon wheels, the past and present existing in layers that only the land truly understood. The Sterling Ranch remained in the family for generations, a testament to what could be built when survival depended on seeing truth clearly, rather than through the convenient distortions of prejudice and fear. And in the mountains where no census ever reached, where hidden valleys held communities that chose invisibility over integration, the story was remembered differently, but with equal power. The tale of a white woman who chose honor over comfort, who stood between worlds and refused to let either side reduce humans to categories, who proved that even in the hardest country, mercy could be more powerful than vengeance and truth, more enduring than lies constructed to protect the guilty.